But now what you all came here for. So I am happy to introduce Andy Norman. He is a public philosopher and award-winning author, and he leads the Humanist Initiative at Carnegie Mellon University. So today he's going to be talking about his newest book, Mental Immunity. In it, he lays out the conceptual foundation of cognitive immunity, and it's the emerging science of mental immune health. That's a tongue twister. So the book is not yet out. It goes on sale on May 18th, but it is available for pre-order on a number of sites, and I will go ahead and drop a link for that in the chat as well. So Andy, it's a pleasure, and I associate you're also involved with a chapter of our SSA chapter at Carnegie Mellon. So we work with Andy quite a bit on a number of different ways here as well. So without further ado, Andy, very happy to have you joining us today, and I will let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and not just for the invitation to speak, but also for doing such terrific work with our nation's secular youth. I think it's great. It's really important work you're doing. So, and thank you all for turning out tonight. I have some questions initially for everyone in attendance, and to get your answers, it looks like I'm going to need to rely on on you using the raise hand function, which is a button near the bottom of your screen. So I initially have some questions that if you click on that, you'll be able to register your answer. All right. Okay. So who here shares my concern about rising partisanship in our nation? If you share that concern, please raise your hand. All right, looks like we have 42 participants, and almost everyone, certainly a very strong percentage, shares that concern. Okay, thank you. Please lower your hand. How many of you are concerned about political extremism? All right, again, a very solid majority. Almost everyone. Thank you, guys. How about religious extremism? Are you concerned that religious extremism may harm our nation and our world? Okay, thank you. And is anyone else struck by how zany some of the conspiracy theories and science denial that are going around? Do you share my just amazement at, say, the QAnon phenomenon? Wow. Okay. Almost everyone. Thank you, guys. Okay. So now I have some questions for you to think about. I guess you don't need to reply to these. Would you be surprised to learn that the phenomena I just mentioned share a root cause? Would you be surprised to learn that there's an emerging science that has pinpointed that root cause? And furthermore, that this science has revealed the underlying mechanism that goes awry when thinking comes unhinged? I wish you all could see, I wish you had with the normal participants window so you could all see how each other are responding. And would you be surprised to learn that this science that I've just mentioned points to not just diagnoses, but also provides prescriptions, antidotes, solutions to our post-truth predicament? I'm here today to tell you that all of these things are true. In fact, there's a revolution of sorts is brewing in the sciences, and I think it promises to fundamentally change our relationship to infectious ideas. So in the same way that the science of immunology changed our relationship to infectious microbes and allowed us to exert some measure of control over these parasites that have infected human bodies throughout human history. In exactly the same way, I think, infectious ideas actually infect minds, have done for all of human history, and we're on the verge of a science that will allow us to understand how ideas infect minds and what our minds can do to fight back and protect themselves against infectious ideas. I have very high hopes for this science and its applications, but of course it won't happen by itself. What I call cognitive immunologists, and I count myself one, are working to develop this science and its applications as rapidly as possible, in part because we're in a race against time. We've all seen how crazy and destructive ideas can spread like wildfire around the globe with the internet and through social media. And that makes it paramount, I think, that we develop this science quickly and begin to apply it to protect everything we care about from the destructive effects of infectious ideas. So what I'd like to do today is tell the story of this fledgling science and actually enlist your help in the cultural revolution that I think is going to follow on its heels. All right, so I'm going to start with the deep history of what I call cognitive immunology. So I'm a philosopher by training, and the word philosopher means lover of wisdom. And arguably what philosophers do is try to understand what wisdom is and how we can acquire it. And so for at least 2.5 millennia, philosophers have been trying to understand how various forms of human foolishness get their roots into human minds and what we can do to counteract bad ideas. The so-called Socratic Method, developed by one of my intellectual heroes, is actually a very sophisticated tool for inoculating minds against bad ideas. And I'll have more to say about that later. So in the course of over 2,000 years of philosophical inquiry into the nature of knowledge and to the nature of wisdom, philosophers have discovered many things that can actually help us reduce our proneness to false belief and other forms of folly. But until now, until recently, we've lacked a good way to organize these findings and to scale them for widespread folly mitigation. One, I think, criticism of philosophy that it's worth raising is that, hey, you guys have been after wisdom for a very long time, and why is there so much foolishness in the world, given how long it's taken you to study this issue? I think that's a reasonable criticism and one that philosophy needs to understand. Fortunately, there's some new conceptual tools emerging just in our lifetime that could, I think, help philosophers address humanity's problem with deep forms of unwisdom. So I'm going to fast forward now to a second stage in the evolution, if you will, of cognitive immunology. I want to talk about the germ theory of disease and the discovery that the body has an immune system that helps to protect us against disease. So you've probably all learned that Anton von Leeuwenhoek, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, a Dutch microscopist, actually trained his microscopes on the very, very small and found a world just teeming with microbial life. It wasn't too long after that that the germ theory of disease gained a footing, and we came to understand in a much better way why illness and sickness spread the way they do. In about 1800, Edward Jenner, an English doctor, inoculated his gardener's son with the cowpox, and thereby achieved in that gardener's son immunity to smallpox. That was the beginning of the science of immunology, And it was still another century after that, around 1900, when the Russian zoologist Ilya Mechnikov discovered that the antibodies that rush to the defense of a body that has been invaded by parasites. What Mechnikov did actually was take a citrus thorn and he stabbed a starfish larva with it and looked at it under a microscope, and he saw that the starfish larva was sending cells to the point of the thorn and surrounding it and trying to prevent it from further harming the larva. So over the course of a few centuries, just recent centuries, we've come to understand that our health depends on a huge number of microbes that are busy trying to make homes in our body, and to counteract that, defenses, an immune system that has evolved to keep us alive in the face of those. And we've learned an enormous amount about how the body's immune system works and how we can fortify that system against different kinds of disruption. We now have ways of modulating modulating the body's immune response, because sometimes the immune system gets overactive and actually attacks the body's own tissues. And of course, the crowning achievement of immunology in some ways is the development of vaccines like the smallpox and polio vaccine, which have saved literally billions of human lives. It's an extraordinary success story. And I actually think it's a sign that we might have be able to affect change at a similar scale with the application of immunological concepts to the problem of human irrationality. So fast forward again to 1960, when a psychologist named William McGuire discovered that minds actually behave as if they have immune system, not brains, but minds behave as if they have immune systems. What he did is he was interested, he got interested in this was the height of the Cold War, and he was worried about brainwashing techniques from the Soviet bloc. And he asked himself the question, how do we inoculate good American minds against the kind of brainwashing that the Russians or the North Koreans might bring to bear? And what he discovered is that if you expose a mind to a weakened form of an idea or an argument, a lot of times that mind will develop a resistance to even stronger forms of the same idea, of the same argument. Now, the question that occupied McGuire was, how can we inoculate minds against new information? He didn't take any stand on the goodness or badness, the quality of the information that might come in. His question was simply, how do we protect minds against new information? And unfortunately, he came up with a set of techniques and a set of findings that have allowed advertisers, propagandists, and religious apologists to actually manipulate and close minds against new information. I think that's one of the sort of dark but unintended side effects of William McGuire's early work, which is generally referred to today as inoculation theory. Now, around 2000, a second generation, around the year 2000, a second generation of inoculation theorists began asking the question, can we inoculate minds against misinformation? So the idea here was to pick information that is obviously false in some way, but that is known to confuse or disorient people, and see whether by exposing them to certain pre-treatments, you can prevent them from taking on that bad information. So I'm talking here about the work of experimentalists like Sander van der Linden, Stefan Lewandowski, John Cook. And in recent years, these guys have done some amazing work, and they've been able to show that, yes, in fact, we can inoculate minds against disinformation. In fact, they've begun to show that you can actually use these techniques to prevent people from buying into science denial. So there's actually articles about the science of inoculating minds against science denial. One of the cool words that these guys use for their techniques is pre-bunking. So as an inoculant, if it takes effect before your exposure to the dangerous thing, it strengthens your resistance to that dangerous thing. And so they call this, these information inoculants, pre-bunking. So you can try to debunk a myth or a conspiracy theory or a cultish beliefs after somebody's infected with them, but it turns out to be far easier to pre-bunk or inoculate them beforehand so they never get infected in the first place. Now, I caught wind of some of these ideas in the mid-90s, began working on them and took a career detour, but came back to it in the early 2000s and began developing the conceptual foundations of a much more ambitious program that I call cognitive immunology. And it's not just misinformation, it's not just inoculation against misinformation or inoculation against falsehoods that I'm interested in. I'm also interested in inoculating minds against bad ideas of all kinds. And some ideas are bad for other reasons than their falsehood. And where many of the cognitive inoculation techniques that are being tried in experimental contexts focus on very specific falsehoods and try to inoculate minds against them. Let's say you can try to inoculate people against the idea that, against anti-vax beliefs, right? And there are very specific things you can do to prevent someone from becoming an anti-vaxxer. But I'm also interested in the very general problem of how you inoculate minds, what a general purpose mind vaccine would look like. And I actually think Socrates, with his Socratic Method, came pretty close to formulating a general purpose mind vaccine. And in the book, I'll say a little bit more about it later, I actually take Socrates' ideas about reasonable and unreasonable belief and developed one of them into, I think, sort of an enhanced form of the Socratic Method that I think has great potential to function as a general purpose mind vaccine. So here's the big idea behind the book. Let me just try to give you the big picture so you can get your head around it. First, bad ideas are mind parasites. They're not like mind parasites or analogous to mind parasites. They actually are mind parasites. So think about this for a second. An idea requires a host. When an idea gets into a mind, it can start creating copies of itself. It can replicate. Furthermore, the wrong kinds of ideas, bad ideas, can actually harm their hosts. Now, what do you call something that invades something else, invades a host, tries to find a home in a host, replicates and harms the host? I would say that something like that has every right to be called a parasite. So bad ideas, principle one, are mind parasites. Principle number two, minds really do have immune systems. Now, I didn't discover the truth of this claim by focusing a microscope on the brain, because there's no one widget in the brain that has the job of fighting off bad ideas. But the mind generally has a great deal of infrastructure for keeping bad ideas at bay, while also letting good ideas in. Critical thinking is one word we often use. Curiosity turns out to be another feature of a healthy mental immune system. Fair-mindedness is another. There's actually a lot of things that contribute to mental immune health. So the way to think about mental immune systems is think of them as distributed across many different brain modules. But if you define mental immune system as a mind's infrastructure for spotting and removing bad ideas, then it just follows directly that they exist, because minds do in fact have operations that perform that function. Now, these mental immune systems of ours, they protect us more or less well. Some mental immune systems do a very good job, others do a very poor job. Furthermore, we now know that mental immune function can be suppressed and even corrupted by certain kinds of ideas. Now, one example that may resonate with you as a group of secular students is I actually think that the concept of faith, insofar as the concept of faith gives you permission to believe things that don't otherwise measure up to our basic standards of responsible belief. Insofar as the concept of faith functions in that way, it's actually a mental immune disruptor. It actually helps to diminish the mind's ability to keep bad ideas out. And in the book, I identify another 8, 10, 12 mental immune disruptive ideas that humanity needs to overcome if we're going to become robustly immune to infectious ideas. It's no accident, by the way, that QAnon belief is especially that Christians, that devout evangelical Christians, are very highly represented among QAnon followers. It's not an accident, I think, in part because religious institutions often train the mind to accept things in the absence of evidence. And once your mind starts to go down that path, it can become unhinged or disconnected from the objective considerations and evidence that otherwise anchor belief. Incidentally, there's a really interesting finding just last year, in 2020, by a Canadian research team led by Gordon Pennycook. And what Pennycook found is that if your belief, if your meta belief that beliefs should change in response to evidence goes away, you become dramatically more susceptible to many different kinds of bad ideas. I'm not just talking about, say, unhinged forms of religious fundamentalism, but deranged forms of political ideation, conspiracy thinking, science denial. Actually, you become an easier target for a cult leader if this particular belief that ideas ought always to change in response to evidence gets damaged or suspended. Even before I'd come across Pennycook's research, I had concluded that the social norm that says we need to yield to better reasons, that we need to give up ideas that fly in the face of better reasons, that social norm is actually the linchpin of mental and cultural immune systems. So when you damage that norm by, say, just defying standards of evidence in the way that our former president did for 4 years, when you do that, you're actually actively damaging the culture's capacity to prevent bad ideas from spreading. So it's no accident that QAnon belief has spread wildly in recent years. So just say a little bit more about the book, and then I would really want to go to question and answer. I call the book Mental Immunity, and it's about how mental immune systems work and how the healthiest minds use reasons to sort out which ideas are worth hanging on to and which ideas need to be dispensed with. It turns out you can use reasons well and become strongly immune to bad ideas, and you can use them poorly and become even more susceptible to them. The mere fact that you can sling reasons around is not an indication that you reason well. In fact, many of the cleverest, you can be extremely intelligent and extremely clever, misuse reasons, say just to confirm what you already want to believe, and end up having a compromised mental immune system. So the book talks about how reasons work, why reasons fail to work when they do, and the kinds of things you can do to become a better thinker, and how to strengthen the mental immune systems in your orbit. Because it turns out that some relatively modest changes to the way we interact with ideas and the way we interact conversationally with others can allow more accountable forms of cognition to spread virally through our culture. So if you, say, buy the book, read it, become aware of some of these conversational tricks that I talk about, you can actually begin using them in the conversations you have, and thereby strengthen the mental immune systems of your families and of your family and friends. And that is how I think the scientific revolution can lead to a larger cultural revolution that might spare us from some of the worst outbreaks of viral nonsense. Let me mention one other idea that I think of as a mental immune disruptor, and I argue this in the book. You're all familiar with the idea that everyone is entitled to their belief, to their beliefs. That idea functions to excuse unaccountable believing. That idea has enormous currency in our culture and has since the founding of America. So the founding fathers of America actually believed in liberty of conscience. And that meant pretty much that everyone is allowed to believe what they want. Now, that was an important principle to build into the Constitution, as long as we're talking about legal rights. We don't want the government telling us what we have to believe. So it makes sense to enshrine this idea of entitlement to believe as a legal right. But it, of course, doesn't follow that we have a moral right to believe irresponsible things. If I believe that I don't need to wear a mask because during COVID, that's an irresponsible belief. That's not a belief I should hold. So that's just a very simple example of an irresponsible belief. And one that, in the end, I'm not morally entitled to indulge in, nor am I morally entitled to indulge in white supremacist fantasies or misogynistic delusions. So we all need to rethink this idea that we're entitled to our beliefs and get over the attitude of entitlement that allows anybody with an internet connection or anyone at all to simply say, my beliefs are as good as yours, because that flattens everything, brings about a relativistic culture that can't fight back against irresponsible and damaging ideas. So everyone is entitled to their beliefs is an immune disruptive idea. We need to weed it from the meme pool and begin to instill in people a more accountable attitude towards our own mental states. Okay, I did want to show you what the book looks like and invite you to pre-order it. I'm also going to invite you to follow my Facebook author page, because that's a way I'm going to try to get you connected with other people who are working to bring about this cultural transformation. Kevin, are you sharing my screen?
I can do that for you.
Oh, you know what? I bet I can do it too.
Actually, I don't know if I can. Yeah, there you go.
Let's see. You guys can see the book cover?
Yep, it's showing now.
Okay, so that's what the book looks like. Kevin mentioned it'll be out in May. You can pre-order it now, and I hope you will. And I'd love to get you involved in the cognitive immunology revolution. So join me on Facebook for that, and I'll see if I can get you plugged into people who are trying to turn these ideas into much needed change. Okay. Did you stop this sharing? Thank you. Perfect. Okay. That's the end of my presentation. I'd love to hear your questions and see what you offer.
Great. We already have a few questions stacked up and ready to go. So Jack, he said, sort of in the beginning, you had mentioned exposing the mind to a weakened form of an idea confers some immunity against stronger forms.
Yes.
Isn't that also sort of known as straw manning as an idea? If not, how is it different?
Yeah, I would say that a straw man argument is one. So as long as the person doesn't recognize that this straw man argument is in fact a lousy version of the real thing, it can actually function to have that kind of inoculating effect. So a really nice job of making the connection there, Jack. I mean, once you point out that it is a straw man argument, that it's not the real deal, ideally at least, that would reduce the inoculating effects of that argument. Incidentally, religious apologists, I think, have been using this phenomenon. You take a strong version of an argument, say from Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, and you twist it into something much weaker, and you show a bunch of young religious people the weakened form of the argument, show them that the weakened form fails, and then later, if they actually encounter Dawkins or Harris's work firsthand, they tend to brush it off. They say, "Oh, I've seen that argument. It fails." So we actually see that phenomenon being used by religious apologists in some cases to cement religious belief in the face of the kind of criticisms that the new atheists are raising. Thank you, Jack. Nice question.
Right. And we had a couple of people sort of, can you give some examples of debunking or more ways to prevent infection of bad ideas?
Good. I'm going to assume the questioner meant pre-bunking here, because so imagine, so there was a wonderful, I think, This American Life episode just a week or so ago about a young man who was pulled into a cult, kind of a rapture slash, the Belgian government is trying to implant RFID chips in all of our brains kind of conspiracy theory. And it took this kid, even after he was broken out of the cult, it took him years to recover his mental stability, and he still suffers as a result. And the moral of that story is that it's actually extremely hard to deprogram somebody who's deeply invested in a conspiracy thinking. Debunking, more generally, is hard. Pre-bunking, however, often is much easier because the mind is still more pliable and open to those things. So I think the questioner asked for an example. So this isn't pre-bunking example, but the Berkeley sociologist George Lakoff has studied the way in which the media often presents two sides of an issue as though they were the same. So if you get a climate scientist on one side of a split screen, and Joe from down the street who's done his own research online to say that climate change is a hoax, and you give them equal time, people will come away from having watched that broadcast thinking that, oh, well, some people say this, some people say that, who's to say? So Lakoff has been urging the media to stop indulging in this kind of false equivalence, right? Here are both sides of the issue, and they're equally worthy of attention. He actually says the best way to debunk or pre-bunk fake news is to use what he calls a truth sandwich. So a truth sandwich goes like this. Here's the truth about what happened during the 2020 election. That's the first slice of bread. Here's what Trump and his supporters say. That's the filling of the sandwich. And then come back at the end of the treatment saying, and of course, Trump and his people who are claiming the election was stolen are wrong. So you bracket or you create a sandwich around the falsehood with truth both before and after. It turns out that you get that's much more effective at helping people overcome spot disinformation and shed disinformation. I hope that answers your question.
Sure. And this is it sort of seems like the next take on something you just said. Dave says, would you like to discuss further the idea of equal rights to have belief versus belief equivalency? So it seems if beliefs are tied to human rights, for example, it becomes a good baseline to compare beliefs and their viability. Wow,
there's some depth to that question that I'm only beginning to get my head around. So I may flail around a bit in trying to answer it. I think it's extremely important that people be treated as having equal rights. But I don't think we should treat every view as equally valid. Nor does let's say the QAnon shaman's view about the 2020 election, nor is it just as good as the opinions about the election that are put forward by data scientists like, who's the guy who wrote the book on Josh Silver, right? The guy who does 538. So yes, people should be treated as having equal rights, but ideas, beliefs, opinions, no, let's avoid the conclusion that every opinion is equally worthy of attention.
We have a question from Martha. She says, it seems that our public schools have a crucial role in developing our young people's ability to use critical thinking. What suggestions do you have for the education of young people?
Beautiful. So that's a terrific question. Who asked that question?
That was Martha.
Thank you, Martha. Really nice question. So the concept of critical thinking was first put forward by the philosopher John Dewey almost 1 century ago. And it very quickly gained a following within certainly higher education as one of the guiding lights of what a good education should provide, critical thinking skills. And for almost a century now, we've emphasized critical thinking skills, and it's become palpably clear to many, I think, just in recent years, that it's just not enough. That critical thinking skills, certainly the way we've been teaching it, aren't enough to inoculate minds against the kind of infectious ideas that now spread very rapidly across the internet. Here's a few reasons why the cognitive immunology paradigm takes us far beyond the critical thinking paradigm. So people who teach critical thinking, and I did it myself for about 15, 20 years, we tend to focus on skills. Here's a set of skills you can use when you evaluate ideas. The problem with mere skills is that they can be used selectively, or they can simply be ignored and not used at all. So having the skills doesn't guarantee that you'll use them, and using them doesn't mean you'll use them to challenge your own beliefs the same way you would to challenge other people's beliefs. So if you simply learn a bunch of critical thinking skills and use them to batter the ideas you dislike, and just to bolster and fortify the beliefs you do like, you are not a skilled thinker, and you certainly don't have a strong mental immune health. In fact, that's an example of somebody using reasons just to, in the service of confirmation bias. You give critical thinking skills to a motivated reasoner, and they just become a skilled propagandist, basically. So we have to go far beyond teaching critical thinking skills. We need to be teaching the traits of mind, the habits of mind, and the sensibilities that wield critical thinking skills to one or another end. So we need a much broader vision of what, of how to educate young people. And I think the idea of mental immune health, cognitive immunity, gives us that broader framework that will allow us to reinvent education for life in an internet-connected world.
And mentioning sort of the internet-connected world, Chevy says, why on Facebook when that medium, why are you on Facebook when that medium enables devolvement to the least common denominator of discussion?
I do wrestle with whether I should use Facebook at all, and I'd be lying if I didn't admit that I'd considered abandoning Facebook 2 or 3 times just in the last year. I don't want to abandon some of the most powerful tools for Facebook. Allows bad ideas. Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Telegram, many of these online services allow bad ideas to spread rapidly and unchecked, but they also allow good ideas to spread rapidly. And if those who want to defend good ideas simply abandon the most powerful media networks to those who are simply in it to make money, or in it to bolster their political power, or in it to hoodwink people, we're going to lose the culture war badly. So I'm not sure it would be wise to abandon Facebook. I think the idea would be to simultaneously use it as best we can to promote not just good ideas generically, but also strategies for inoculating minds against bad ones, while also urging our representatives to regulate social media in ways that make it harder to post irresponsible ideas.
Great. And Jack says, different groups of people consider different ideas dangerous or bad because they come from different perspectives. Is there any concern that folks will use this approach in a dark arts sort of way to inoculate minds against ideas that we think are good, like skepticism or the scientific method, Enlightenment values, etc.?
Really great question. So many of you have probably heard about the Chinese government's attempt to, that they've confined a huge part of the Uyghur population, which is, I think, a Muslim sect in China. And they're actually trying to deprogram these Muslims and to give up some of their Islamic beliefs. And they're beginning to use the language of inoculation and immunity to justify what they're doing, which is draconian and in some ways very like the Big Brother envisioned by George Orwell's 1984. So I won't deny that these concepts can be misapplied or applied to devious or destructive effect. But I don't think that affects, but that doesn't make them not true, and it doesn't make them not useful. It just means that we need to develop wisdom and apply and fight for the benign or constructive application of these ideas, and to fight against the destructive application of them.
Great. And another pre-bunking question. Jared asked, does pre-bunking effectiveness against future bad ideas depend on memiplexes already existing in a person's mind?
Who was that? Who asked that?
That was Jared.
Jared, thank you, Jared. Yeah, so Jared there is using a term, I believe, from Richard Dawkins. Dawkins had an article in the early 90s called Viruses of the Mind, where he talks about gangs of ideas that infect minds and cling to minds more readily than single isolated ideas do. So if you have the idea that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, on the one hand, all by itself, it's relatively easy to dislodge that idea from a mind. But if you combine it with other ideas like faith is a virtue, and God will reward you with heaven, and the entire complex of beliefs, or memeplex, has a stickiness or an infectiousness that none of its individual component beliefs does. So Jared there is, I think, probably has come across that same article by Richard Dawkins, or perhaps someone else has used that term as well. Memeplexes. I mean, because ideas get wrapped up with other beliefs, and because we become emotionally invested in them. Actually, some of the most interesting work done in this space is by a Yale psychologist named Dan Kahan. He argues that what he calls identity protective cognition is extremely widespread, not just among religious folks, also among secular folks, not just on the right, but also on the left. And the idea is that once you become, once you fuse your identity with a set of ideas, it becomes very hard to think in a fair-minded way about those ideas anymore, because any questioning of those beliefs threatens your identity. So one of the morals of that story that I develop in the book is that we should try not to pin our identities on particular beliefs. We should treat beliefs, as I argue, as house guests that might wear out their welcome and need to be shown the door. Maybe an idea is working for you. Maybe a certain belief kind of makes sense to you. Well, allow it to hang around for a while. Maybe it'll benefit you. Maybe it'll improve your thinking. But stay on the lookout for for downsides to that idea, because they might eventually come to the fore, at which point you need to say sayonara to that belief.
Great. And Thomas asks, would you give an example of how pre-bunking could be used on a one-to-one encounter with a family member or acquaintance?
Very nice. So I'm wondering, so if the family member of acquaintance has built their identity around the belief you want to question, it becomes very hard, right? So imagine, like, crazy Uncle Frank who shows up at Thanksgiving and wants to talk about Obama trying to seize his guns for the umpteenth Thanksgiving in a row. How do you deal with that? Well, that's a hard case. That would be a debunking, since Uncle Frank has already bought into these ideas about Obama's coming after his guns. But if somebody had gotten to Uncle Frank early enough and pointed to and calmed his fears about the jackbooted thugs of the Obama administration coming after his guns, there are non-threatening ways to loosen up beliefs that have begun to harden. There's a technique called motivational interviewing that may speak most directly to your question. If you attack somebody's beliefs or make them look silly, it'll almost always backfire. That's not the way to change people's minds. What you do instead is you ask gentle, clarifying questions. Ask the person to just open up and explain what they mean. Just show, as to whatever extent you can, a sincere interest in understanding their point of view. Help them explore the point of view and pay attention to aspects of their worldview that they might have overlooked. And just gently ask them how they deal with this question, or how they reconcile that with this other thing. It has to take the form of a collaborative examination of the ideas. It has to be accepting, it has to be supportive, it has to be, you have to build trust before a conversational interaction gets somebody to let go of a deeply held belief. And even then, you might plant a question and it might take 3 or 4 weeks before the question really sinks in and results in real change. You can't expect conversations to change deep elements of a worldview overnight.
Wonderful. And Aileen asks, is there a psychological event that affects the mind, or is there anything physical going on in the brain?
Yeah, so I believe the scientists who tell us that every time a mental event happens, there's underlying physical neuron firings that make that happen. So we know this from several decades of neuroscience research, that when a person's brain is damaged in certain ways, they actually lose corresponding mental functions. So self-control, there's a certain part of the forebrain here, which if it's damaged, you lose a good deal of your self-control. We've never seen any evidence that people can have ideas or think thoughts without brain activity happening to make the thoughts possible, which is why I suspect that when we die and the brain ceases to operate, that our mind dies with it.
And Steve asked this early on in your presentation. He said, is postmodernism a mental immune system disruptor?
I love that question. I would say yes. I've certainly seen elements of postmodernism that are highly immune disruptive. So philosophers have noticed since ancient Greece that when relativistic attitudes take root in a culture, people stop holding each other accountable for their beliefs. So the basic idea is, well, you have your beliefs, I have mine, who's to say what's right? That who's to say question functions as a mental immune disruptor because it stops value inquiry, it stops critical inquiry in its tracks. Postmodernism is an intellectual movement that flourished in academic circles since, I don't know, maybe since the 70s or the 80s. And much of it, to my philosophical eyes, is driven by a kind of relativistic view that all points of view need to be taken equally seriously. I think that's a mistake, and the spreading of postmodern ideas has actually in some ways crippled our culture's immune system. Great question.
Wonderful. And we'll do this as we're running a little close on time, so we'll do this as a last question. And what I can do is I can put your website information if people want to ask you some additional things as well. But Jared says that he goes back to the classroom a little bit. He goes, what would you teach a first grade child to inoculate against bad ideas without the cooperation or input from parents?
First grade child, wow, well, terrific. I love the question. I think the number one thing I would do if I was, say, a first grade teacher is encourage my first graders to discuss philosophical questions, life's big questions, right? The questions about, how do you know if something's right? How do you know if something's wrong? Is it wrong if I break the rules, but end up helping someone? What if I follow the rules and end up hurting somebody? Is that right or wrong? When you get kids discussing these questions and listening to one another, their mental immune systems get stronger. I'll say this also. Doubts and qualms are actually the mind's antibodies at work. So when a new idea comes to you and you're not sure what to think of it, there might be a little voice in the back of your mind going, I'm not too sure about this. Or what about this other thing that seems to conflict with that? If you train your mind to listen to those little niggly voices, you're actually allowing your mind's immune system to function well, because each of those little doubts or those qualms or those reservations is going to bring to your attention some aspect of the new idea. It may not be the decisive aspect, but you really need to take account of as many of an idea's properties as you can. Positive or negative? Is it true? Is it false? Is it well evidenced, poorly evidenced? Is it helpful? Is it harmful? All of those things merit consideration. And when you listen to those doubts and qualms and reservations, you actually start to develop a more nuanced sense of the pros and cons of ideas. And your mind becomes more capable of fine discrimination. I actually think that you can develop morally by learning to listen to those qualms. And by the way, it's not enough to listen to your own reservations and qualms. You have to listen to other people's questions and objections too, because a lot of times they see stuff that you don't, and you can see things that they don't. You can help each other grow and become more morally mature. And those kind of conversations can start even in first grade. So great question.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for your time today. I think, over, as you sort of alluded to a few times, the last 4 years and the growing last 4 years, and so we reached the pinnacle, in 2020, I think have been really shown a need for a more concerted effort for all of us in this. And I think every day we are sort of dealing with this issue and continue to see the need for this. So clearly something that I think is on the mind of many people. So I appreciate your time today. Thank you everyone for joining us. Andy's information about pre-ordering the book is in the chat. And if you go to Andy's website, there's also, of course, a link to the book, purchasing the book in there as well. So again, Andy, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all. Thank you, Kevin.